My name is Colin McKibben, Lead Developer Advocate at SailPoint, and in this session I'm going to cover the details of workflow. So we're actually going to go into the workflows user interface, show you all around, and actually build some complicated workflows using the capabilities that it has to offer. All right, so let's get started. So if you have workflows, I encourage you to open that up on your tenant and follow along with me. I'll try to go slow so people can keep up, but yeah, this could be a very fun interactive session. So this is the main workflows page. It shows you a table of all the workflows that you have in your org. So you can see the name of it, when it was created, who the owner is, as well as how many successful runs it's had, what the error rate is, if it's having any errors. And then some actions here that you can download the workflow JSON, which is a script that describes how the workflow is run. You can manage them by deleting them, duplicating them, and also enabling and disabling. So maybe you don't want your workflow enabled yet because you're still building and testing it. There is a provide feedback button. So, workflows under heavy development, we're adding new features all the time. So if you have a suggestion for improvement, we encourage you to click that provide feedback and submit those details. All right, so let's talk about how to create a workflow. So to do that, you'll click on the new workflow button and you're presented with 3 options for creating a workflow. We're going to start with building your own in the workflow builder. So this is building one from scratch. First thing you need to do is give it a name and an optional description that just maybe describes what the workflow does so it's easier for you to understand later. And now we're presented with the workflow UI builder. So on the left-hand side, you can see all of the different steps that you have available for adding it onto the canvas. We have triggers. These are the things that actually kick off your workflow. Many of them are based on our ETS triggers, so the event triggers that you see over here on the tab here. There are some unique triggers, just unique to workflow, like the external trigger and the scheduled trigger, and we'll cover those later. You also have actions. So these are actual actions that call into IdentityNow to perform something like getting identities or triggering certification campaigns. And then finally, we have operators. So these contain if-else statements, the looping operator, and your end steps. So let's start by building a very simple workflow. To start, we always need to start with a trigger. So I'm going to select something simple. We'll do, how about an identity attribute changed? We drag that onto our canvas, and immediately it shows us some details about that step. Now, most triggers allow you to use filters. I encourage you to use filters. If you're not adding a filter to your trigger, you might be doing something wrong because typically you probably don't want your workflow to activate on every event that's coming in. We'll cover trigger filters later, but I encourage you to definitely look into this, fill it out. It's going to make your workflows run much smoother. Okay, so we have our trigger on there. Next, let's do an action. So let's get an identity. So maybe we have an identity attribute changed, and now we want to use an action to get more information about that identity. So I drag the get identity action onto the canvas. Now I need to connect these 2 steps. So I click on the little dot below identity attributes changed, and I drag an arrow to the top of my get identity action. This now links the trigger to the get identity. Next, let's say I want to send an email to that identity. So I scroll down, I find the send email action, and drag that onto the canvas. And once again, I connect those 2 actions together. So now you can see we're starting to build a flow of data here. Now every workflow must end with one of the end step operators. There's 2 options here. There's a success or a failure. So if you know a certain branch of your workflow should trigger a failure message, then you're going to want to use the end step failure. But if a branch should end in a success, then you're going to want to end it with a success step. So assuming I can get the identity and I can send the email, we want this to end successfully. Okay, so we have our workflow on the canvas, and now it's time to configure each action. So under the get identity action, what we're going to do here is we're going to select an identity that we want to get more information about. couple options here. You can either use the drop-down to select an identity from your tenant, or if you know you want to use a variable to get the identity, maybe you want to select the identity that triggered the identity attributes changed. Instead of entering by value, you can choose a variable. And this allows you then to enter JSON path expression. So I'll cover JSON path in a little bit, but there's an easier way to do this by using the variable selector. So when you open the variable selector, you are presented with a drop-down here that shows you all of the steps that you can select data from. So you can only select steps that are above the action that you're currently configuring. In this case, the trigger is the only step above get identity. And then over on the right, you can see the different variables that the get or the identity attributes change trigger provides you. So I know I want to get the identity ID who caused this trigger to happen, so I'm going to save that. And what it does is it fills in the JSON path for me. Next, let's configure the send email. So we have to send this email to somebody. So once again, you're presented with an option to either select an identity in your tenant, or you can choose a variable. So in this case, I'm going to choose a variable again. And if I look at my steps in the dropdown, now I have two options. So the send email has two steps above it, get identity and identity attributes changed. So I want to get a variable from get identity, and I want to get that identity's email address. So I will select the email attribute from there, click save, and then again, you can see the JSON path is filled out for me. We'll give it a subject here. And then a message body. And that step is configured. Now the end step success doesn't need any required configuration, so that's already good to go. You can see down at the bottom left here, no validation errors are detected, so our workflow should save and run successfully. So I will go ahead and save that. Successfully saved. And now we can test the workflow. So I'll click on the test workflow button. We are brought to the test workflow page. Here you'll see your workflow outline. And on the right, you'll see the workflow test input. So the input is a configurable JSON data structure that you can change, and this is the data that will actually be sent to the first step in your data flow. Now these are sample inputs. The data in here actually isn't based on any data in your tenant. This is an example test input. Now if you're relying on certain fields in this test input being accurate to your tenant, so like you want to be able to send an email to an identity, you need to make sure you update that test input so it actually has correct data. A nice feature of this is that right above here, Workflows does provide you with your own tenant or your own identity ID in your tenant. So as long as you're not doing anything destructive to your identity in this workflow, you're pretty safe to use this identity, copy it, and paste it into the test input. And that way, if we're relying on that identity ID in any of our steps, we actually have a real identity we're working against. Okay, so my test input is set up. I'm going to click Start Test, and I expect that this workflow will succeed and it will send me an email. So as it runs, you'll see which steps are completed via the green check mark, which ones are in progress via the blue spinning circle. Once it's complete, if you see all green down there, that means it's successful, no errors were detected, and you can check the outputs. So actually, let's go to my email, and you'll see, oh, there it is. Yep, so I got an email from the workflow. Now the test workflows feature allows you to click on each of these steps and view the inputs and outputs that they provide. So we can see for our trigger, here was the input that it was provided. If I want to click on the get identity, again, you can see the input that the get identity action was provided. So in this case, we're getting my identity and my tenant. You can also click on step output to see what data this action will provide to the next step in the workflow. So in this case, This is all of my identity information. So that's a great way to debug and understand more about what your workflow is doing. Now let's start a new test, and this time let's give it an invalid identity ID. And let's see what happens when we fail the workflow. Okay, so when you get a failed workflow, it will tell you exactly which step it failed on. So in this case, the trigger was fine. We got data from that. But the data that we supplied to the get identity was bad, and we need to explore more why that failed. So if we look over here on the right, we have a helpful error message here. It says request failed, 404 not found. So given that we're trying to find an identity and we're getting a 404 not found, it probably means that the identity ID that I supplied it doesn't actually exist in my tenant. And so you can validate that. You can look up that identity ID using one of the APIs or even the search UI and just make sure that what you put there is actually in your tenant. So that's a great way that Workflows provides debugging information for you when your workflows fail. All right, so I'll exit out of this test. I'll go back to my main workflow page. So there's actually a couple more ways that you can create workflows. One way is starting with a template, as Tom was mentioning earlier. So templates are pre-configured workflows that solve common use cases that customers might have in IdentityNow. So we have this template library, lots of templates in here. You can read a summary of them, a description of what they do. And if you have one of those common use cases and you find a template, it's a great starting point to get you up and running quickly. So if I scroll down and let's say I want to do a pretty common thing, create and activate a certification campaign, I can select that template. I can change the name, which is usually recommended, but I'll leave it here as it is. Continue to builder. And then you will see that the workflow is already pre-populated for me, all of the steps that you need to create and activate a campaign. Now, the only thing you have to do is make sure that you modify each of the actions so that it corresponds to what you want it to do. So maybe the identity attributes changed. Right here it's saying, only trigger when we have an attribute department change. So if that's not what you want to trigger on, make sure you change that. And just go through each step, make sure that it's fitting for your tenant details. You can also add or remove from this template. You aren't stuck with the steps that it gives you. So maybe after creating a cert campaign, maybe I don't want to send an email. So I can just delete that. You're free to modify it to your needs. The template is just a great way to get you up and running quickly. And then the last way to create a workflow is by uploading a script. So earlier I said one of the things that you can do on each workflow is download the workflow definition. I'm gonna go ahead and click that. So this workflow definition is a JSON file. That describes the workflow in code. So this JSON file, when it's loaded into workflows, will actually be decoded from this JSON structure into the visual builder that you're familiar with. Now, why is this useful? Well, maybe you need to share a workflow with a colleague, or maybe the community has provided a workflow for a common use case. What you can do is you can take these JSON files, these workflow definitions, and actually upload them into your tenant as another form of like a template, a way to get started. So when I click New Workflow, if I select the Start with JSON file, you have the option to upload a file. So I will select the file that I just downloaded. You can see it pre-populates the name with whatever the definition said it was, but you can change that name. And then when I continue to Builder, it will load that definition kind of like a template. And you can see we have the exact same workflow that we started with. All right, so those are the 3 ways that you can create workflows. So now let's get into some more advanced topics. So workflows uses a language called JSON path to aid in the selection of data when you're referencing variables and actions. So if I go back to one of my workflows here, maybe the send email action. Recall that we were able to choose a variable here. So the variable selector is actually just an easy way for you to select data, and then it will transform that into JSON path. So this string that you see right here is actually a JSON path expression that tells workflows where to get the email attribute from. Now you can freeform this. You can type this in yourself. You don't have to use the variable selector. There are advantages to doing that. The JSON path implementation that workflows and event triggers uses is called JWay. It's actually an expanded set of operators and functions over the basic JSON path, which is Gesner. So one thing to point out is when you're testing your JSON path expressions in an online editor, make sure you use an appropriate one that supports the JWay operators, because many of them don't. They just support Gesner. So you could be testing against the wrong implementation. So I recommend if you're building JSON path yourself and you want to test out your JSON path, make sure it's going to work before you put it in your workflow. Head on over to developer.salepoint.com. Under IdentityNow, we have our IDN documentation. Go to the event triggers docs, and under filtering events, we have a very good reference guide here on what filtering is, and as well as all the expressions and operators that you can use in our implementation of JSON path. There's a lot here, a lot of complex things you can do to filter that data and get at the variables that you need. So I encourage you to read this, get familiar with it, because there's a lot of power here. Now, as I was saying earlier, if you want to test out your JSON path before putting in workflows, we have a link to a JSON path editor here that has very close compatibility with our implementation. So I highly recommend you use this one to test out your JSON path. All you have to do is copy and paste the JSON data that you're working with in the input, and then you can use your expression up here to see if it works or not. So back to trigger filtering. So most workflows or most workflow triggers are based on our ETS triggers. So those are triggers that actually trigger when certain events happen in IdentityNow. Now each trigger offers the ability to filter those events so you don't get everything. Now, as I was saying before, if you're building a workflow, you probably don't want every event coming in. In this case, every time an attribute or identity attribute changes on every source, you probably don't want that. You probably want to look at maybe an identity attribute that only changed on a certain source, or maybe only certain attributes that have changed that you want to do some action on it. That's why it's important to use filtering. So some of our triggers and workflows offer a basic filtering option. This is just an easy way to say, hey, for like identity attributes changed, I only want to trigger when, say, the last name has changed. If you need something more advanced, all of our triggers offer the advanced option where you can put in a raw JSON path filter expression. Now to test filter expressions, what you can do is you can actually go to the event triggers UI. Over here we have all of our available triggers. Whatever you're interested in this case I'm interested in the identity attributes changed. You can subscribe to that. Give it a name, we'll say developer days. Subscription type will be HTTP. We need a way to be able to test what kind of data is coming in and going out. So we need some sort of tool that will show us what the result of an event trigger is. Again, if we go back to the filtering events documentation, there's a good guide on here how to actually develop and test those. One way you can do that is using a site called webhook.site. This is a great way to test event triggers. So it gives you this unique URL when you log in. I can copy that, paste that into the integration URL, and now all of the events that this subscription creates will be sent to my webhook.site testing service. We don't need any authentication for this. We won't put a filter on yet. I'll also leave it disabled. I'll hit save. So this creates a subscription. Now, if I go over to my subscriptions, you can see there's my developer days subscription. So here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna test subscription. I'm gonna go over to webhook.site, and you can see, here we go. I did get an event from IdentityNow from that test subscription button. So the test data is static for each trigger. You can't change that, but what you can do is you can apply some filters to start testing the filter syntax that you're working with. So let's say I want to filter on this event trigger to only give me events if the department has changed. So what I can do is I can go here, I can edit the subscription, go down to the filter, and using that filter events reference in our documentation, I can start crafting a JSON path filter expression. I could say something like $.changes. Well, I only want to trigger if it's the department that has changed, and the department, let's double check that here. And the new value, okay. And the new value for that attribute is equal to, we'll say sales. Okay, so we have our JSON path expression in there. Update that as successful, it's a valid expression. And now I expect that if I send a test subscription, that filter should match, and I should get another event in my webhook.site. Okay. Well, it seems like it didn't, so there might be something wrong with it. Let's try something a little simpler. There we go, so that one's sent. Oh, I see what I was doing wrong. It's referencing the wrong new value here. All right, so we want to make sure the attribute is department. And at.newValue is equal to marketing. Okay, yeah. So this should fire a successful event. So if I test subscription, I should see 2 events in my webhook.site. There it is. Okay. So that's working. Now you can also test the inverse. So I just tested a successful run here. I said, okay, like the attribute needs to be department. That's got to be one of the changes. And the new value needs to be marketing. So that was successful. Now what if I want to test the inverse and make sure that, if those don't match, it won't trigger on that? Well, to do that, all I have to do is go back here and say, instead of marketing, let's say engineering. So again, our test data is static when you're testing subscriptions. So engineering should fail. And if I send a test subscription, I should not see that event show up in webhook.site. And indeed, it's not coming through. So that is, in a nutshell, the power of event trigger filtering. It's a way for you to limit what data is coming to your workflow, so you reduce the number of invocations. You don't have to set up complex if-else statements in your workflow to handle that filtering for you. You can just apply it directly to the trigger filter, and it will handle it all for you. So as part of this testing, I got a valid filter that I like. What I can do is I can copy that, and in my identity attributes change trigger, I can paste that in, and now we have a valid filter that's going to do what I want. One thing to note, when you're testing workflows, the filter is not actually honored. Whatever you put in that example input payload when you test the workflow is what's going to be sent regardless of the filter. That will be changing in the future. We will be able to simulate filtering events when you're testing. But for now, just know this is not going to be honored when you test the workflow, only on live workflow executions. All right, so that is how trigger filtering works. Let's move on to comparison operators. So I'm going to start a new workflow. In this workflow, we're gonna do some complicated stuff. It's not necessarily a real world use case, but it will show off some of the more advanced capabilities that Workflows has to offer. In this case, we're gonna listen for an identity attributes changed event, and we're gonna listen for an employee changing departments into a new department. We're gonna check if that identity that's changed departments has a manager. If they do, then we're gonna say, congrats, you joined a new department, here's your manager. If they don't have a manager, then what we wanna do is we want to look at all the managers in our tenant and send each one of them an email asking them if they're willing to be the manager for this person. So to start, we need to start with our trigger. In this case, I'm looking for an identity attributes changed event. I'm going to ignore the filter for now, but again, it's highly recommended that you always add a filter. Okay, so if a person has changed departments, next we want to get more information about that identity so we can look up their manager, because this event will not send the manager information that we need. Right, so to set up our get identity, I am going to select from a variable. Again, you can use the variable selector, or you can type this in manually. We'll save that for now. Now, we need to check if this user, this identity, has a manager or not. So to do that, we need to use one of our comparison operators. There's several different types of comparison operators. You can check for equality between Boolean values. You can check strings. Strings match some criteria. If a number matches certain criteria, even timestamps. The one we're going to use is the verified data type, because what we want to do is we want to see if this identity has a manager or not. So to set this up, click on my operator. In the first value, we need to select the identity's manager ref ID. So I will scroll down until I find the manager ref. Here we go. Now, if this manager ref ID exists, then the person has a manager. If it doesn't exist, then they don't have a manager and we need to find them one. So there's a couple options here. You can check if a field is a Boolean, a number, a string, is null. In this case, we just want to check if it exists or not. All right, so now we have a comparison operator and we have two paths to handle for. So in the event that the identity does have a manager, the condition will evaluate to true. So what happens if they have a manager? Well, in that case, we just want to send them an email, kind of like a welcome email. So for testing purposes, rather than using a variable for the recipient, I'm actually going to select my name here, just so I get the email and I can see how it's working. But when you want to go live with this, you would actually select the identity's email address. Okay, now for the subject, this is going to be a welcome email. So we're going to say welcome to, well, this is a conundrum. So welcome to what, right? We want to welcome them to the department that they just moved to, but how do we get that name of that department? We can't just type in welcome to sales, because what if the person's not in sales? What if they move to the engineering department? Well, this is where inline variables comes into play. So inline variables allows you to mix text, like our welcome to, with data from the workflow to create dynamic strings that are more sensical for what we're trying to do. So to use an inline variable, you always have to start with double curly braces. This initiates the start of the variable that you're trying to reference. Then you type in some JSON path to the variable that you want to use. So in this case, I want to get data from the get identity step up here. I want to get that identity's new department. Okay. And then I will close my variable or my JSON path with closing curly braces. So you can see here, to reference an inline variable, you start with double curly brace, your JSON path, and then double closing curly braces. So what this will do is when the workflow runs, it will always render this welcome to as you typed it, but then it will replace this inline variable with the actual variable that you're referencing, which in this case would be whatever department this person moved to. So in our body, this is a welcome message. So again, we can use inline variables here. All right, so our body, we're going to say, welcome to X department. Your manager is the person your manager is. Okay, so every branch of your workflow needs to have an end step. So all I'm doing here is on the true branch is going to send an email. So I need to terminate it with an end step success. So let's handle our false condition now. So if the user does not have a manager in the department that they switched to, well, we need to inform them they don't have a manager, and then we need to find a manager for them. So let's start by sending them an email. Again, for the recipient, I'm just going to select my email address so I get the email, just for testing purposes. And then in our body, we're going to use some more inline variables. All right, so next step, we informed our identity that, hey, you don't have a manager, we're going to find one for you. So now we need to find all the managers in our organization. So for that, I'm going to use a get list of identities action. This action allows you to query for identities in your tenant in a number of ways. So you can do it by search query, by a saved search, tags, managers, etc. In this case, I'm going to use a search query. So the search query is going to take a query exactly like how you would use it in our search user interface. So for this, I'm going to look for all identities in my tenant that has the following criteria. Must be a manager and must exist in a certain source. In this case, my authoritative source. So that is a valid search query that you would also use in the search user interface. All right, so we have a list of identities who should be managers. So what do we do with them, right? We need to send an email to each one of our managers asking if any one of them will be willing to take on this employee as another report. Well, we can use the loop operator to loop over every manager that we get out of this get list of identities, and then perform the same action, which would be to send them an email asking if they will be the manager. So loops only work on lists of data. And that can be from an action like get list of identities, which produces a list of data, or it could also be on the data from, for example, identity attributes changed, which one of the properties in that trigger is a list of changes. So you could operate a loop on the list of changes if you wanted to. Whatever the input comes from, just know it has to be a list of data. It can't be anything else. So I will drag my loop operator onto the screen. I will hook up that into my workflow. And now I need to configure this loop. So the loop requires an input that is an array or a list. In this case, I'll use the variable selector, get list of identities. Yeah, so we want to, in our loop, use the identities that we got from our get list of identities. Okay, so we pass it in that list of identities. The loop context is an important thing to note. So the context allows you to include data from previous steps in your workflow into the loop itself. That way, if you need to reference any data from outside of the loop, the context allows you to do that. If you don't put anything in there, then the loop cannot access anything outside of the list of identities that I provided it. So that takes a JSON path. You can provide the path to an individual action if you only need data from that certain action. Or if you need data from more than one action, what you can do is you can type $, and that will pull in the entire action up the chain. So I'll use $, there, save that. And okay, let's start configuring our loop. So a loop is actually a sub workflow. So what that means is you can actually drag one or more actions and operators into your loop, and it behaves just like a workflow within a workflow. So in our case, we want to send an email to each of the managers in our list of identities. So I'll find the send email action. I will drag it into my loop. And you can see now we have like a sub canvas here within the loop that we can start manipulating our actions. I also want to make sure that what's in my loop is also terminated with an end step. You have to terminate the workflow inside your loop with an end step. So in this case, it'll be an end step success. So let's configure the send email. So once again, for testing purposes, I'm going to select my identity to receive the email, but in a production setting, you would actually select the identity that you're getting from the loop, one of the managers. So I want to receive those emails just to see what they look like. And then in the subject, again, we're going to do some inline variables to make a customized subject. Now to reference variables from a loop, you do $.loop dot context, because in this case, I need to get information from the get identity action. So I have to reference my context that I set up in the loop in order to get that information. So $.loop dot context, the action name, so get identity, and then the property that I'm pulling from, which would be the name. So that would be the name of the person who does not have a manager. Okay, so in my body, We're going to customize this with some inline variables. We'll have a greeting here to the manager that we're asking to be the manager of this identity. Again, we say $.loop. Instead of context, since we're pulling information from the data that we provided in the loop, we're going to say loop input instead. And that would be our list of manager identities. And now we want to get the manager's name. It's quite the call to action, isn't it? If only all organizations just randomly assigned employees. All right, and that's all we need to do to set that up. And the last thing we need to do is make sure that we terminate after our loop. So you don't always have to terminate after a loop. You can continue to add more actions after the loop. But in this case, we're done with that. So we're going to end the workflow after this loop is finished. Now, a couple important things to note about the loop operator. Currently, there is a 50 item limit for loops. So if you provide a list that has more than 50 items in it, it won't execute. That's a hard limit right now. We're looking into increasing that limit in the future. Another thing to note, actions within the loop, or not actions, iterations of the loop do not execute synchronously. They execute asynchronously. So this means they will all be kicked off at the same time. They don't rely on each other to finish before kicking off. So that's just another thing to note. All right, so let's test that. So the first test I have, this should be a positive condition. This identity should have a manager. And as we can see, it executed successfully. It took our true path. And if I look at my email, you can see, yes, we did indeed get the email for that. Now let's try another test here with the false condition that uses our loop. I will plug that identity's ID in there. Try that one more time. Let's try this. Let's go back into our test workflow. Try plugging that data in again. Well, it's possible that the identity I'm trying to use, oh, there it goes. It's just taking a little longer to run. Okay, so yeah, going down the loop or the workflow here, hit the false condition. Now we're on the loop step, so it's going to loop through all the identities that are managers and send them all an email. In my tenant's case, there's only one manager in the source that I supplied, so this loop should only execute once. it's still executing, but you can see that it is indeed starting to send out an email here for the identity that doesn't have a manager. So you can see here's our identity name, needs a manager, just joined the engineering department, everything that we talked about. So when that's done running, it will show you how many successful loop iterations were executed, how many failed loop iterations were executed, so you can see if there were any failures within that loop. Oh, there it goes. It just finished. So like I said, there was only one identity here that was a manager, so only one loop iteration. The only iteration was a success, and we successfully completed. All right, so that covers some of the capabilities that Workflows has to offer. There are certainly more. I didn't have time to get to them, but there's also the external trigger, which allows you to trigger your workflows from external sources rather than just IdentityNow events. There's also the HTTP action, which allows you to call out to different SaaS services other than the actions that we provide here. So that trigger and the HTTP action allow you to really expand what's possible with workflows by connecting to more data sources. So I hope that was helpful. Hit me up in the chat or in the developer forum and we can talk more about workflows.